Our next speaker is Holly Cunningham, who will be speaking about pediatric mental health issues that have resulted from immigrant prejudice. Holly is the mental health coordinator at Kentucky Refugee Ministries, a nonprofit organization that resettles refugees and welcomes immigrants. She has worked alongside international communities in various capacities for over a decade, and she has a background in elementary education and theological studies. Holly taught young students in public school for many years, and she's led summer education programs for immigrant families. She earned her Master of Divinity at Wake Forest University and went on to work as a hospital chaplain in Louisville, Kentucky. She now provides refugees and asylum seekers and helps them connect with mental health providers and community support groups and other trauma-informed healthcare practices. She offers provider education around language access and cultural competency and works with community leaders to find creative, holistic approaches to care. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Holly Cunningham to speak on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, amazing. Well, thank you again for having me to speak today. It's really an honor to be here with you all. I've been working with international communities for a long time in different contexts. So first as a teacher, and then as a hospital chaplain, and now at a refugee resettlement agency. And so this is something that is really near and dear to my heart. I am hopeful that today's training can really just give some context to migration experiences and increase awareness of who it is that is in our community, naming the impacts that prejudice and bias have on mental health, and then just discussing ways we can reduce some of that stigma in the spaces that we work and live. The stories of people who have migrated here for whatever reason are really rich and vast, but often sometimes devastating in ways. And so I'm just, again, honored to be able to speak to some of those stories and just to share some of what I see in the work that I do. And certainly I'll try to leave some space for questions at the end, but I know we'll have a panel discussion afterwards too. So just to get started here, I want you to think about any time that you maybe have experienced some form of bias or discrimination yourself. Maybe it was, about your weight or sexual orientation or identity, as our previous panelists touched on, or maybe it's just as simple as something that you enjoy that others think is strange, or something else about your appearance or about the place that you're from. And, thinking about how that feels to have something said to you or about you, or when someone has perceived you in a certain way. Just think about those experiences as we kind of move forward, and the weight that might carry for you individually. And so we'll focus now on some of the things that our refugee and immigrant communities hear and experience too, and the weight that has on them. So just some common stereotypes that you probably hear or have heard, in either the spaces where you are or on social media, calling folks aliens, which, even though that is technically a legal and political term, the othering of that word, outsiders viewing immigrants and refugees as uncivilized or dangerous, unintelligent, uneducated, maybe violent or disrespectful, different and weird. All of these words, I'm sure you can think of 100 others too that people hear. The messaging that we get on a day-to-day basis has a deep impact on the internalized view that someone holds of themselves, as well as the societal view that we have on groups of people. I know often for children, especially in school spaces or maybe medical spaces, there can be some preconceived notions that a student won't respect women or listen to their female teachers or providers, or there's a fear that they're going to be violent or that they're going to be a runner and, flee the spaces that they're in. There are views that they don't want to learn English or that they're not capable. And these things, become internalized over time, and they really impact especially how kids and youth view themselves, and also how they view their families and their communities that they're a part of. And so I think the more that this messaging is heard, the harder it is to undo some of those intrinsic beliefs. But in reality, immigrants and refugees are mothers and fathers, their children, their brothers and sisters and siblings, their friends, inventors, creatives, artists, students, valued members of community, and just people with hopes and dreams just like anyone else. And so when we get to know people on a more personal level, and we get to build those relationships, it can really change how we view others. And so I think also when we share messaging about refugees and immigrants, if we can try to shift the narrative towards these really humanizing pieces of them, and the parts that make them special and the values that they bring, that can just have a tremendous impact community-wide. And so as we get into this presentation, I'm going to start with just a little bit of context and some kind of overarching definitions and a few numbers about kind of who is here in Louisville from the refugee and immigrant community. And then we'll dive more deeply into kind of the impact of prejudice and bias on mental health. So just a couple definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. A refugee is someone who was forced to flee their home to escape persecution, war, or violence, and they were seeking safety in another country. So they fled and are unable to return due to well-founded fears of persecution, which might be based on race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. The emphasis is that they were forced to flee. There was no other choice if they were to remain safe and to protect their lives and the lives of others. They had to leave home. And so if someone has refugee status, they have gone through a very intensive application and approval process before being resettled either in the US or another country. That process can take years. It's very intensive and it's not something to be taken lightly. But once they have gone through that process and received refugee status, they are fully protected and entitled to government benefits, agency support from places like KRM where I work, and they have a direct pathway to residency and citizenship. So an immigrant, on the other hand, slightly different in definition. This is someone who voluntarily fled or left willingly from their home or country to resettle elsewhere. So it's a pretty broad definition. There are a lot of categories of immigrants and a lot of different experiences of why folks might be leaving. But broadly speaking, an immigrant is someone who voluntarily fled their home. They can be documented or undocumented. So documented means they've been admitted to permanently reside in the U.S. as a lawful resident, and undocumented simply means they do not yet have legal permission to stay. There are a lot of factors that go into that, which would be for a whole nother presentation. But just to know that people are facing many barriers and are trying very hard to find safety and to get the documents they need. And there are a lot of barriers to that. And then just two groups of immigrants that we work with a lot, especially in Louisville and at Kentucky Refugee Ministries, would be asylum seekers. Everyone has a legal right to seek asylum. And an asylum seeker hasn't yet received their legal recognition or refugee status, but they are in the process waiting that claim decision. And so again, seeking protection, seeking safety, this is the common thread of all of these folks that we're talking about. And a parolee, this one's important because we have a lot of Cuban and Haitian entrants in the US and especially in Louisville, and a lot of them fall under this category. It is a temporary protected status that allows someone to enter the country while they're still in legal proceedings to determine their immigration status, or if they're going to be deported. But it's a response to large-scale emergency and humanitarian crises, which can be from like natural disasters to extreme political and social unrest. But this just hopefully gets us all a little bit on the same page of who it is that we're talking about today. And in Louisville, these are the populations that we are currently seeing. These are the number of arrivals who have come just to the city of Louisville within this last fiscal year. So as you can see, the number of Cubans is enormous. Over 6,000 Cubans have come to Louisville just in the last year due to a lot of political and social unrest there. We were the third largest hub for Cubans actually in the country. And then we have a very large Congolese population here. We resettled a lot of folks from Afghanistan after the recent Taliban takeover, and you can see those other numbers there. And then just as far as youth numbers, we have 16% of all Louisville arrivals are under the age of 18. But I wanted to note that nationally, 40% of resettled refugees, so that does not include other immigrants, but 40% of resettled refugees are under age 18. So it's really a very large portion of folks who are coming here, and these numbers constantly ebb and flow as circumstances change. But hopefully this can help us know just a little more about our neighbor and who it is that we're serving. And some of the languages spoken just commonly from those different countries. So mental health, kind of honing in on things. Mental health is our experience of emotional, psychological, and social well-being. So it affects how we think, feel, and act as we cope with life. And what children intuit about their identity and abilities and capacities to learn at this age really stays with them for their whole lives and shapes who they are and who they'll become as individuals and as community members. So we have to prioritize the mental health of young people and paying special attention to refugees and immigrants and the unique barriers that they face. And the unique prejudices that they bump up against. And so that's what we're going to focus in on for the rest of this presentation. So just diving into some of those prejudices and discriminations, they come in many forms. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but discrimination, it can have a really detrimental impact on young people and their sense of self and social identity, especially when they're in those developmental years. Everything that they hear and the messaging they receive and the treatment they receive really impacts that formation of who they are as people, just as each of you has been shaped by the messages you have heard and received and things you've been told about yourself or your community. Those stick with us on conscious and subconscious levels. So particularly for our refugee and immigrant populations, there's a lot of racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination that happens. You know, predominantly, we hear a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric, a lot of anti-Black and Hispanic rhetoric in the social media, in the news, kind of it's embedded in most of the messaging that we receive in media around us. And that can really shift a person's view of just acceptance of themselves. There's also a devaluing of native languages. So if someone does not speak English as their primary language, they're immediately seen as less than in some way, in this country at least, when really there is a rich diversity of language that folks speak. And in fact, a lot of refugees speak multiple languages. And so I think that's something that really needs to be uplifted and celebrated, instead of being kind of something to shake our finger at and say, oh, but you don't know English. And then that kind of leads to low educational expectations, and also low views of people's intelligence. So children are also often told that if they don't speak English or if they don't understand something that is being said to them, that they are stupid or uninterested in learning or unable to learn, when in fact, the language barrier is often the only thing at play. It's not really a reflection of someone's intelligence, but simply our way of communicating. And then there are a lot of just negative views of, looks, practices, culture, that can be internalized over time. And these can happen directly and indirectly. So sometimes discrimination happens in really explicit ways. People making explicit comments about race or personal appearance or ability, but often it can happen implicitly, and it can be as simple as someone being ignored or overlooked, or being believed to be inferior, or when we have a lack of patience with someone's language barrier, or when we question people. A lot of our clients get questions like, well, why don't your parents speak English? Or why don't you do this thing the way that I do it? Or why do you eat that food? Or why do you wear those clothes? Things that sometimes kids ask these kind of questions innocently, but adults also ask these questions, or make them known. And that can also be really harmful, as kids internalize a lot of shame around anything that makes them feel other or different than. And so when they get different treatment at school or at the doctor's office or even at the store, when people look at them with a skeptical eye or thinking, like, kind of, when people are stereotyped at stores, like, is that person going to steal something? Or am I going to be able to communicate with this person because I hear them speaking another language? So what are they saying? Like, those kind of questions are very othering. And those, especially for children, it can be confusing when people don't understand you or don't see the fullness of who you are. There's also a lot of bullying that happens, especially in school spaces, particularly a lot of our clients, when they wear more traditional clothing, maybe that's certain patterns or a certain style of clothing or a head covering. There can be a lot of bullying and teasing about that. There's also a lot of bullying and teasing that happens about certain foods that our children are eating, or maybe even the way they smell because of different foods or things that are in the home. And those things should be celebrated, but often there's a lot of kind of negative association around that, especially in school settings. And just one kind of recent experience that we had, but this kind of happens a lot, with students are being, placed in different schools. And sometimes if we present to the school the fact that we know this child is struggling with X, Y, or Z, or this child might have certain behaviors that are going to show up in the classroom. It's not because they don't want to be there. Here's, some of the trauma that might be impacting that. We'll have schools and teachers that, to us, kind of make it clear that they don't really want that student at their school, or maybe we could consider a different placement. And the underlying message is, we're not sure we're going to be able to handle that, or that we want to, because it's something different than what we're used to. And so that can be really harmful too. So just to be aware that, we want to keep communication open and have dialogue about the unique needs of each individual child. And sometimes that can be taken in a negative way. So in addition to prejudices that we just discussed, there's also a lot of trauma that happens in the resettlement process that I just wanted to share, so that you can be aware of. These are kind of compounding to the prejudice and trauma that children are experiencing once they're here. Of course, prejudice and discrimination can be traumatic. And so everything we just discussed is really important. And then knowing this kind of resettlement background is also important to knowing some of, not that it's the same for every single person, but just some of the things that these children may have faced in their journey here. So there's kind of 4 stages of resettlement. The pre-flight stage is when they're still in their home country, but in a place of extreme instability. Often human rights abuses and violations are happening. There's violence or threats and targeting, persecution of people based on ethnic group, identity, beliefs, political group, those kind of things. And then so there's a lot of fear there. Of course, that makes sense because people are forced to make the decision to leave everything behind in a moment's notice, because that fear or persecution is so intense and at such a high level. But this can be really hard for children to understand, even if they know that the situation around them is not good or not okay. It can still feel very confusing to suddenly have to leave your home, leave your friends, leave your belongings, everything that you have known in your way of life. Even if it was scary, it is still really hard for children to make sense of having to leave that behind, and especially on a moment's notice. And so then flight and displacement. Flight is that period of time between leaving home and reaching a place of temporary safety. That experience can be a spectrum of time. It could take hours, days, weeks, months, or even years at times. And usually there is a lot of kind of danger involved in that journeying period. Also lack of access to basic things like food and water, medical care. And so, of course, especially for a child, again, in their developmental stages, when they're going through this experience where their stressors are constantly high and their trauma response is being triggered regularly, and their basic safety and well-being is not, or basic safety needs are not being met, that really impacts the development of the brain and those traumatic responses in the body. And then displacement, once they reach somewhere like a refugee camp, a detention center, another space of temporary safety, the those barriers are still in place. So the lack of access to adequate food and water or resources, clothing, shoes, things that we take for granted every day. Children are not getting these things, and they're not always getting their needs met, and attention to, just their general development as children isn't focused on, because there's so much else going on. Again, these are broad statements, but this is just the common experience. And then resettlement, that's something that, many migrants look forward to and have lots of hopes and dreams about, and a lot of ideals about somewhere like the United States. Many beliefs about what it's going to be like when they are actually resettled. And unfortunately, a lot of those expectations are not necessarily met once people are actually resettled. So, people get to the United States and then experience all these prejudices and discriminations, and there's culture shock, and there's so many things to adjust to that would have been hard to prepare for, that you can't really know what it's going to be like. There's also immediate changes in social and economic status. Whatever status someone had back home, or whatever role they played in society, that is different now in this new country, where they may not know the language, or may not on paper have the skills for a certain job or a certain program in school, when really there are just differences. And it doesn't mean someone does not have the capability to do something, but they're treated as such. There's also a loss of identity and a sense of home. Often clients are also resettled into lower income areas, which, due to other systemic issues, can have higher rates of violence or crime. And so clients are still in a traumatic space sometimes when they're resettled. There are a lot of governmental barriers to the types of income and resources that people can receive. And so when we think also about the biases we have around poverty and housing, and the clothing that people wear, or the food they're able to buy, that is something that shows up really strongly, especially when clients are still just trying to get back on their feet, trying to find work, or the right school fit, so that they can build these resources again. And I say that, I know we're focused on children, but the impact of prejudice on the entire family unit also shapes just how children see their home environment and themselves as a part of a family and community. And social media is just one other that should always be touched on. The news and the messaging that people hear there can be really unsettling. And then when folks are on social media regularly, they're kind of bombarded with those messages or bad news from back home. And if others in their community aren't aware of what's happening in those places, it can be very isolating as well. So I won't read all of these, but just there are a wide variety of distress responses that children may have, that you will see in the spaces that you work with children. So something as simple as acting scared, having separation anxiety, being very jumpy or sad, disconnected or withdrawn. Sometimes children will complain of certain physical pains that could be related also to their mental health. Stomach pain might be about nutrition, but it might also be about anxiety or fear. And then we can see some disruptive behavior sometimes, maybe aggression or misconduct or outbursts. But we know that children are just trying to communicate their needs, and sometimes they don't have the language or the emotional learning yet to know how to do that in a calm way. And so sometimes we we judge behaviors just on the surface of what it looks like, but underneath, a lot of these behaviors are just responses to distress and the immense change that children have been going through in this process of migrating to another country. So there are a lot of ways that we can impact mental health and well-being. And some of these, I'm hopeful that folks on this training are already doing, and some of these might be things we can implement. And just know that if your organization or place of work wants any extra resources or guidance for any of the things we discuss, we can always connect you with that too. So how we can impact mental health and well-being, we can use more inclusive language, which I know other presenters have talked a lot about. We can lead with curiosity and a desire to learn, not just trying to check it off on a box like, oh, I know this thing about this person, but really just wanting to know individuals on a deeper level. We can celebrate diversity, especially in the books that we read and the images or graphics that we use in the places we work. So most or many children's books and most images in medical offices or other offices too are featuring white American individuals or families. But as we know, representation matters. And so when children are able to see themselves in books or images, it really makes a difference in their sense of self and belonging in community. And so when we can use more images that feature non-white American people, it goes such a long way. I'm sure many of you have seen something as simple as, the new Little Mermaid movie with the Black mermaid instead of a white Ariel, and the videos of children seeing the preview for that movie for the first time and saying, oh my gosh, she looks like me. That goes such a long way. And our clients often express this, when they see images of people that look like them, or when they read stories with characters that look like them, or that come from different places around the world. It's just so affirming to their sense of self and well-being. Making community connections, building upon community across cultural groups. Language access, I'll touch on that a little bit more on another slide. We can reduce stigma and just talk about mental health from a more inclusive viewpoint. Often there are a lot of taboos and beliefs about mental health, here in the US, but also in other countries. And so really talking about it from a more holistic perspective of emotional health and well-being and how it connects to physical health can really help to reduce some stigma around that. And then cultural competency. So having knowledge that cultural differences as well as similarities exist without assigning values such as better, worse, right, or wrong to those cultural differences is critical to the work that we do, especially with people who are different from ourselves. So a basic understanding of someone's home country, for example, is really helpful, but it's not the only step, because if we just learn a few basic facts, it might lead to further stereotyping or making snap judgments. But what we want to do is learn about the cultural values and things that feel significant to individuals. Who is the individual? What makes them special? What do they value and want you to know about their culture or the life that they were living when they were in their home country? That is at the center of cultural competency, is getting to know individuals and the cultural values that make them special. And it is a mindset that leads to lifelong learning. So it is not a one and done thing. This is something that we hopefully do over the course of our lives. We can also practice cultural awareness in the way that we communicate. respecting differences. So, often you might be working with a child and they're not making eye contact, or they're really close to you when they're talking, or they're really far from you when they're talking. And things like that you might read as a sign of respect or disrespect. But in reality, it could just be a cultural difference. Eye contact is a big one. Sometimes in other cultures, it's actually a sign of respect to divert your attention and not make direct eye contact. So to try to avoid assuming what something means, especially if there might be a cultural reason behind it. I won't go over all of these for the sake of time, but I did want to just touch on the language access piece, particularly for those of you who are working in spaces where you might have access to interpreter services, or if you would like to add access to interpreter services. It is so important for people to be able to communicate and understand things in their native language if they do not yet have enough English language skills, especially in medical settings. So using an interpreter is just one way that we can really, really help not only increase understanding, but then also improve mental health, because it's very stressful if you don't understand what's being said to you. If you're using an interpreter, don't use, and it's with a family, don't use the children to interpret for their parents. This can be really disruptive to like power structures and dynamics at home, but it's something that we see happening all the time because children do tend to learn other languages more quickly, especially when they're in school. But don't make kids interpret for their parents. If at all possible, get an interpreter on the phone, on the language line, or in person, and speak in first person directly to the client. The interpreter is just the go-between. Try to avoid, side conversations and just be present with the person that you're working with if you're using an interpreter. And we can also find other ways of communicating too. So nonverbal communication is just as important as verbal communication. Thinking about our body language and posture, facial expressions and gestures. Don't be afraid to repeat yourself and speak, slowly in simple sentences. That can go a long way. And you can pull out Google Translate on your phone if you're in a pinch and you don't have any other way to communicate something. We want to avoid keeping those stress hormones active in children as much as we can. And so when folks around them are just speaking really fast in English and not creating any other way for a child to understand what you're saying, it can be very stressful, and that over time is hard on a child's mental health if they're constantly feeling stressed or trapped or confused. So we can be really intentional about our communication, and it goes a very long way. And then finally, just making sure that we're creating healing and safe spaces. So I'll reiterate celebrating diversity and trying to use more diverse imaging and, maybe translated texts or materials, things like that in the spaces that we work. And incorporating music, art, and play into our work with children is both healing and inclusive. So there, of course, are many ways that people can express themselves, and being able to connect with music or art sometimes is a really good way for children to connect to some of their roots or things that they remember from home. This can be a way to celebrate other cultures, and again, it kind of helps with that language piece. We can incorporate mindfulness and grounding practices with children to help recenter in their bodies, especially when those stress hormones are going, and maybe when there's a trauma trigger or response, to just try to be patient and take deep breaths and ground ourselves using visual aids is also really helpful back with that communication piece. And then again, just valuing the knowledge and wisdom of others. If nothing else, this is what I would really highlight as far as how we can really improve the mental health of children and try to decrease prejudice, especially for refugees and immigrants, is just valuing the wisdom that they are bringing to the table, valuing the cultural experiences and traditions that they are bringing from their home countries. Really to say that this core identity of yours and these pieces of you that you bring to the table, we value them, we honor them, we see them, and we want to know more about them. That just by and large goes such a long way with how people's perception of self is developed, and therefore how their mental health is over time. So I know I want to leave a little space for any questions or answers. So thank you all for being here today and being a part of this presentation. I know these slides will be posted, and so there are some resources and references on the next few slides if you do download those after this symposium.
Holly, that was a fantastic presentation, and so much good information that we can all use. We do have a couple of questions and comments, so let me share those with you.
Great.
Let's see. One was from Julia Richardson. She mentions the voluntary description may need to be discussed and clarified. Many families leave their homes because of death threats and imminent danger. So even though they're not a legal refugee, but they're not really leaving voluntarily. It is described in the immigrant description.
Yes. So I agree fully with that statement. The word voluntary makes it seem as if people want to have to leave their home, and that is not necessarily the case. That is just the commonly used and understood definition, but your point is very valid that we need to be aware immigrants, just like refugees who have already received that status, are leaving because of well-founded reasons to do so, and often because of safety concerns and fears. And so, yeah, I'll be aware of that, though, too, in the presentations I make. I can make some more clarifiers about that, because I agree with what you've said.
And a wonderful comment saying from Christina Bailey that this is such great content, so much important information needed for all of us caring for resettled immigrants. And I had a question, Holly. I know your agency provides mental health supports to immigrants and refugees. Are there other agencies in the metro area that specifically address mental health services for this population?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gail. I would say two things. One, we are always trying to expand the network of providers who do work with immigrants and refugees, especially in mental health. And because those providers need to either have someone who speaks another language or access to interpreters, as well as either accepting Medicaid or providing low to no cost services. So if you are a provider and want to work more with the international community, we would love to connect with you. But there are some great groups doing work with these communities. La Casita Center works explicitly with Spanish-speaking individuals and with uninsured individuals, and they have some great mental health services along with many other services. There's a small counseling group. It's called New Hope International Incorporated, and their providers are from different regions of Africa that speak primarily Kinyarwanda, Swahili, and French. And so they have been providing some great therapy services for especially like our Congolese community. Places like 7 counties and like JCPS mental health practitioners do have access to interpreters as well. And then there's quite a network of places we refer people within the family health centers. If you're familiar, they have some great behavioral health services too. But again, it's something we're always trying to expand as well, just to be as inclusive as possible.
Well, thank you so much. That's really helpful information. And again, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you again for sharing your knowledge and recommendations with us.